Hello everyone and welcome to week 7. We are in the final stretch of our class, so that's definitely an exciting time. We only have this week and next week before the class is over. And I sincerely have enjoyed working with all of you during these past few weeks, and I will certainly miss working with you once the class is over. So as a reminder, please make sure that if you missed any assignment, to please work on it and hand it in. Also, if you did submit something and I have not yet graded it for you, I do apologize, of course, for this oversight, but please do email me again about it so I can take care of it before the class is over. Alright, so for this lecture, I wanted to talk about the final project. Now, this project will involve using multiple skills, which we learned this semester. The project is asking us to go out to a public website, fetch some data, clean up this data, then dump it to both a CSV file and a database. Then we also need to plot some data. So we will be using libraries like the requests library, as well as Pandas, BeautifulSoup, and MatPlotlib. And the final project is broken up into two parts. Part 1 is the code, and part 2 is a PowerPoint presentation to explain your code. So the focus of this assignment is to scrape data off the internet, then work with this data that we just fetched. And we will be using COVID data off the Worldometers website. And the steps are as follows. We need to first scrape the data. Then we need to save it to a CSV file, then save it to a database as well. Now here it says 2 tables, but I will accept just 1 table as well. Then we need to update any null values and replace them with zeros. Then once our data is cleaned up, we need to save it to a CSV file again. We also need to do some statistical analysis on our data. And last but not least, we need to plot our data using 2 or more graphs. As to what you need to submit, please include the .py file, and please include the CSV files where you dumped your original data and your cleaned up data. Alright, now let's move on to my code interpretation of this assignment. As always, we start by importing all the necessary libraries that we're going to be using. So I will be using Pandas, I will be using requests, and I will be using BeautifulSoup. Next, I need to go out to the internet and fetch some data. So which website am I going to be using? Well, this is the website link. Now, if we go back to the assignment page and click on this link, this will open up a website for the Worldometers. And here you can see that we have weekly trends, graphs, countries, and news. You can technically scroll down to get to the table that we want, which is this table. Or from up here, you can just click on countries, and that will give you this link, which again in our code is this link here. Then I'm going to call the get method from the request library and then pass it the URL, which we just defined up here. This is going to give me a response object. Then I take this response object and then I create a BeautifulSoup object using the BeautifulSoup class. And I get the content property of my response object. And I'm going to be using the simple HTML parser, which is included in BeautifulSoup. Now, we always have to understand what data we're working with. Okay, now I don't want to work with the now data because this data is going to be changing, from time to time within the 24 hours right now. So this is live data. So what I want you to do is get the data from yesterday. Okay, this yesterday data has been already established. It's not going to change, so it's going to be the same. So I need you to click on the yesterday tab to show you the yesterday data. And you can see here that this table has all the countries of the world. I think there are like 230. Oops. 231. And every country basically has all these data columns. We have total cases, new cases, total deaths, new deaths, and so on. And we also have an index column as well. And at the very top, we have one row that basically sums up all the numbers for all the different columns. Okay, so this is world. Then we have different countries. We also have Europe. You can go by basically contents, okay, but we don't want that. We want the all tab and make sure that you're on yesterday as well. So anytime you work with HTML data, you have to understand what's the data behind the code. So we learned to basically right click in your browser and click on show page source. This is going to bring up all the HTML. Okay, here we go. Now, since I know I'm going to be working with table or my data is in a table, and in HTML, the table tag is basically called table. So I'm going to do a search on table. And when I hit enter, I find these results. Okay. Now, since you might not know what you're looking at, you just need to click on all of them and see what they show on the right side here. But since I've done this before, I know that I want to go down to this one. This is the table tag, and it has an ID for main table countries yesterday. There's main table countries today, there's main table countries yesterday, and then there's main table countries yesterday too, which I think is 2 days ago, not just yesterday. But I want this. This is the data that I want. So I'm going to click on this. And when you start hovering your mouse over the specific tags, up here, this starts getting highlighted. So notice how every line I go, it highlights a specific part of my table. And when I come to here, the table tag, the entire table is highlighted. Okay, so this is where I need to be. Then I can expand it, and it gives me, I have table headers, okay, which now if you look up, it highlights this. Okay, now every time I move my mouse, the highlighting disappears. But when I had my mouse over the T head, which is the T header tags, this row was highlighted. So let's go back here again. Okay, see how when I hover my mouse over here, up in the top half of the screen, the header row got highlighted. And then when I go back down to the T body, which is the body of the table, this whole thing gets highlighted. Now if I expand it, now I can see that my first TR is table row. So my first TR is the world row. And then notice how this has colors in it, and these are grayed out. It means that they're hidden. Okay, this one is not grayed out, so if I hover over it, it shows me that this is the first or the next table row, and this is the USA data. And then if I scroll down to the next TR, then this is India. Okay, see how it's highlighted here, but it's also highlighted in the top half. Okay, now from the table tag, remember we always try to find something by either the class or the ID just to make it descriptive, make it distinctive. So the ID for this table tag is main_table_countries_yesterday. Okay, so this is how I need to find my data using my BeautifulSoup object. I need to find a table tag, but not just any table tag, a table tag that has an ID of this. And in HTML, IDs have to be unique. Alright, so if I go back then to my code, then what I did here is once I created my BeautifulSoup object from the content of the response, I basically going to use the find method in my soup object. I'm going to find a table tag, but not any table tag, a table tag that has an ID of main table countries yesterday, which is exactly has the data that I need to work with. So all this is going to be, this is going to return a list of items. I'm going to store that into a variable called yesterday's table. So now I have everything in my table, which basically has, the T headers, has the T body, has the T rows, and inside each T row is going to be TDs. Okay, so TDs are basically the columns of my table. So TD stands for table data. Okay, see how every time I hover over, the column moves with me up in the top half of the screen. Okay, so you know exactly where you are. All right, so once I have my table, I have it in an object now called yesterday's table. Then I'm going to take yesterday's table. I'm going to go inside the T body of my yesterday's table, because again, here's my table, and inside my table I have a T body element. So I want to get into my T body element. I don't care about the header. I care about the data in my T body. So that's why I do yesterday's table dot T body. And then once I'm in T body, then I want to find all my TRs, which are all the rows in my table. This is going to be saved into a new variable called getRows. Okay, so now I initially got my table, then I got all the rows in my table saved into a variable called getRows. Okay, so far so good. Now the next thing is I need to start building a data structure that's going to capture or hold all or store all my data from my TRs. Okay, so I've decided to basically come up with a dictionary as a data structure. The keys are going to be my index columns, and then which basically going to be 1, 2, 3 for my different countries, and then my rows are going to contain all the data for the different columns. So that's how I'm thinking of designing my dictionary. Right now I created a dictionary variable called dic, and it's going to be blank, so I'm going to start populating it. And the way I'm going to populate it is I'm going to do a nested for loop. My first for loop is I'm going to go through every single row, which is basically all the TRs, and I'm going to find all the TDs, but I'm only going to find the first column, which basically is this index column here. Okay, I'm first going to get the index column so I can capture the values here. And then once I have that, then I'm going to start, and all this is going to be my key portion of my dictionary. Okay, so again, the dictionary is going to have key and value pairs. The keys, I want to make it as these values, which is this column. And then my values are going to be the items in my rows. I'm trying to build a data frame that looks like this table here. That's my goal. That's my aim. Okay, so again, for my keys, I'm going to loop through all my rows. I'm going to find all my TDs just for the first column. So index 0 is the very first column, index 1 would be the second column, and so on. And why is it column? Because I'm calling the TDs, which is the column attribute in HTML, standing for table data. Okay, I'm going to get the string value of the very first TD in my rows. Okay, and I'm looping through it, so every time I'm going to loop through a row, I'm going to get the very first item in my column and capture the string, which should be the number value. Okay, not this one. There we go. So the very first TD in this row, so here's TR, the first TD has a string value of 1, and that's what I'm going to be capturing. And then in my next row, okay, this one is grayed out. In my next row, the first TD is 2, okay, and so on. So I'm going to be capturing the first TD of every row as part of my first for loop, and then I'm going to create a new list variable called values. Right now it's empty, and then I'm going to start populating it. So once I go, one row at a time, then I'm going to have another loop that says, okay, now get me everything in my rows, find all the TDs, and then all those TDs, which again are going to be, if you're looking at the second row, which is India, then I'm going to get this TD, basically all the values in each TD, okay, for every single row. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to append them into my values list. Okay, so again, for my dictionary, it's going to be key and values. The key is going to be the index values, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And then for my rows, it's going to be all the data values across my row. So that's going to form my data dictionary, which I call dic. And once I have the key and once I have the values, then I'm going to start building my dictionary by creating new keys in my dictionary and assigning them values from the values that I just appended here. This now will give me a data structure, which is a dictionary that has all my keys and all my values. Now I'm going to, for this demonstration video, I'm not going to do all 14 columns. I'm just going to do the first 5, and then you can build the rest on your own. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to name my columns, based on my naming convention. So I'm going to call the first column country, the second column total cases, new cases, total deaths, and new deaths. Okay, you can call them anything you want, but again, this is what I'm using for column names. So slowly by slowly, I am building my data frame. Now comes the heart of the data frame. So we are familiar with taking a Pandas object and then using the data frame class and passing it some data. Okay, this basically, again, a data frame from Pandas, and you have to pass it some data. So my data is dic, which is my data dictionary here, and it contains keys and values, which I just built, up in this logic here. So here I have my data, which is going to populate my data frame, but it's going to give me all this data, okay, all 14 or 15 columns, which I don't want right now. You do want that, but I don't want that because just for demonstration purposes, I want to show you something extra. I'm going to be using this iLock property. Now, iLock is an index locator or indexer. So the I, sometimes I've heard it as index location or integer location. I'm not sure which one is right, but that's what the iLog does. It's basically going to find certain rows and certain columns in your data frame. So instead of getting the entire data frame or creating an entire data frame set from your data, you can use the iLog feature and specify only which rows and columns you want to include. So the first value are the rows, and the second value after the comma, see the comma separates here, that's the number of columns. And the colon means that we're talking about ranges. So if I don't have anything before or after the colon, that means get from 0 to the end, or get from the beginning to the end. So include everything, basically. If you do have a number, then you say, okay, I'm going to start at index number 1, and since there's nothing after the colon here, then go to the end. So again, the first value is for rows. So what I'm saying here is, for my index locator, only get me rows that start from index 1 to the end. So I'm going to skip the first row. Why am I skipping the first row? Because the first row basically is my header row, and I don't care for that. All right, I don't want the header row. So up until here, we're building a data frame from my entire dictionary data set, but I'm only going to capture from the first row on. I'm going to capture all the columns in this data frame. Okay, so far so good. Then I'm going to be calling this T letter. Now T means transpose. Transpose basically means I'm going to switch the columns and the rows. So rows going to be in place of columns, and columns going to be in place of rows, and so on. So the reason why we're doing that is, if you remember when we started talking about dictionaries and data frames, we said that if you use a dictionary where you have keys and values, this is going to create a data frame where the keys are the column names and values are going to be our column values. Okay, so again, when you create a data frame from a dictionary, we learned that the keys is going to be the column header, and then the values are going to be the column values. Okay, which is not exactly what we want, because if you look at this, this means that the 1, 2, 3 is going to be the column headers, which we don't want, and then the data is going to come, USA, and then this, and then this. So it's not in a row. This data is not going to be in a row. This data is going to be transposed vertically. Okay, that's how data frames use a dictionary data set to display its data, which we don't want to do. So we want to flip it, and the word for it is transpose. So we want to transpose the default data frame to switch the columns and rows, and to do that we call the .t property. Now once we do that, I still want to also limit the iLog to basically say, okay, I don't want to get the entire 14 or 15 columns. I just want to get all the rows, but only the first 5 columns. Okay, now usually in ranges the 5 is not included, but we do start at 0. Now because I don't have a number here, that means I will start at 0 because indexes are 0 based. So I'm going to start at 0, then go to column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4, and then stop. Okay, but that's still 5 columns because 0 is included. All right, so this basically is saying get all the rows, but just starting from 1, so skip 0, and then get all the columns. Once you do that, please transpose them, switch the rows and columns, and then once you do that, trim off and only show me the first 5 columns and give me all the rows for those 5 columns. Okay, so that's what this odd looking line of code means. All right, now I'm also going to create a custom index column which will be country. I don't want to use 1, 2, 3. I want to use country names, which is more descriptive. And then for my column names, again, columns is a attribute or property of my data frame. I'm going to set it equal to column names, which are my customized column names. Again, you can call them whatever you want. That's up to you. So now that I've built my data frame and I customized my index and I've customized my columns, now the first step is let's dump it to a CSV file. And that's exactly what I do here. I'm going to take my data frame, which I built. I'm going to call the to_CSV method, which basically takes a argument of a name of a CSV file. So I'm going to take whatever I built up here in my data frame, okay, however I customize it, however data I'm using, again, all in DF. Whatever the data frame data holds, it's going to dump it to a CSV file, and it's going to name that CSV file week 7 COVID data.csv. Okay, so that's basically my raw data. It hasn't been changed much yet. I'm just going to get the data. Now, after I get the data, I want to, and this is going to be raw data. And if you notice, okay, I guess I can close this now. You also notice that we have a world row here, and I don't want to include this in my data frame because this is going to skew my data once I start graphing it. Okay, so I want to drop this row. I also want to replace my empty cells with zeros. So in my code, I'm going to first drop the row for world so it doesn't skew my data. And the way to do that is I'm going to take the column df country only where it's equal to world, which it is, and it's part of the df data frame. I'm going to get the index value of it, okay, and then once I do that, I'm going to save it to a country's names variable, and then in the next line I'm going to call the drop method, and as you can guess, the drop method basically drops data from your data frame. So what will I be dropping? Well, I'm going to be dropping the country names, which I just specified up here. And then I'm going to use the in-place attribute. Now, the in-place attribute can be set to true or false. And what does that mean? Well, it means that I'm not going to create a new temporary data frame to work with. I want to work with the same data frame, which is df, and basically make the change in the original df data frame. Okay, now if I do in-place equals to false, it's technically going to create a temporary data frame for me so I can use, and it will not modify the original df. But in my case, I do want to modify the original df, so I'm going to use the in-place equals to true. Then the next change I want to do is replace the blank cells with 0 values. And the way to do that is I'm going to call a fill na method, which is part of my data frame. I'm going to fill zeros where I have blanks. So the fill na means fill the not available or not applicable data cells, replace them with zeros, and again I'm going to call the in-place equals to true, so I'm using the raw original data frame and not a temporary data frame. Once I've made these two modifications, then I want to dump my data again to a CSV file. So up here I dump the original data, you know, unchanged raw data, and then down here, after I made these two changes, I want to redump my data into a new CSV. This time I'm going to call it week 7 COVID data clean.csv file. Then the assignment is also asking us to dump the data to a database. So after dumping into a CSV file, I also want to dump it to a database. So we have to import the SQLite 3 module, which we've learned about before, and then I'm going to call the connect method of my SQLite 3 module. I'm going to give it a name of a database, and in this case it's going to be called week 7 COVID db.sqlite. Remember, the dot extension could be different, not just SQLite, could be .db as well. Now I added a timeout attribute here, set equal to 10, which is 10 seconds. So this basically says if you don't connect within 10 seconds, then I'm going to time out. You don't have to include that, and there's also a default value. I think, I'm not really sure, but it might be just be 5 seconds. But again, you can include this or you don't have to include that. That's just optional. And this is going to create a connect object for us. Now remember, with the connect method, if this database name doesn't exist, it's going to create one for you, and then it's going to connect to it. But if this database already exists, then it will connect to it right away. And again, this is going to create us a connection object. I called it con. Now from the con object, I'm going to call the cursor method, which is going to create a cursor object. Remember, a cursor is what we use so we can retrieve data and manipulate data. And then I'm going to create a string literal called create table, and that's going to have all my SQL command to create the table. Now I'm using create table, which is the default, but I'm also adding the if not exists. So the if not exists, if you remember, basically is going to allow us to run this query without an error, even if the table already exists. Okay, because sometimes you want to run this command or this code file over and over again, but if you run it the first time, it's going to create the table for you with this attributes. But if you run it again and you don't have the if not exists, then it's going to yell at you and say that the table already exists. Okay, so this is just my create table SQL command. Then I'm going to call the execute method of my cursor object and pass it the SQL command that I want to use, which is basically this. So this again is going to create a table called COVID table. I'm going to have 5 columns, a country column, total cases, new cases, total deaths, and new deaths. And then here are the different data types. Text for country, which is string, and then the rest are just integers, which is numbers. And anytime you make a change, either update, delete, or create, then you have to commit the change so that it's no longer just in memory, but it's also stored permanently in your database. So now that we have a database created and we also have a table created, now it's time to populate the table with some data. So inside my data frame, there is a method called toSQL. So just like we had dataframe.toCSV, we can also take whatever is in our data frame and then dump it to a SQL database. So the attributes or the arguments that we need to use is, well, which table do you want to use? Well, I'm going to use COVID table, which I just created up here. And I'm going to use the connection object, which is I called it con. And then if the data already exists, that's another attribute or another argument, I'm going to use append. Okay, so you can, if the data already exists, you can keep adding to it, or you could, also erase it. And then I'm not going to use an index column, so I'm going to set the index equals to false. Okay, so here I dump the data to CSV. Now I'm going to dump my data to a table, which I created up here, which I also going to be part of the database, which I created up here. So now that we have data in our CSV and now we have data in our tables, now we need to start drawing out or plotting the information. Now here I only have an example of just one data plot, but the assignment calls for at least 2 or more. So I'm going to be importing the Pandas module as well as PyPlot, which is part of MatPlotlib. I'm going to alias both as PD and PLT, and I'm going to basically use my DF, but not the entire data frame. I'm going to use just the very first 5 columns or the 5 data values from my data frame. The reason why I do that is if I try to plot all 230 countries, it's going to be squished and it's not going to make any sense. It's not going to look very helpful. So I just want to plot the first 5 to see how it looks like and to basically test my Python code as well. So for my data frame, I'm going to modify it as just a data frame, the first 5 records of my data frame. Now what am I going to be plotting? Well, for my x-axis, I'm going to be plotting just the country column, and for my y-axis, it's just going to be my total cases column. And I'm going to create a bar chart, and I'm going to pass it the x and y as my data, and then the rest are all optional, but I'm going to use the color pink. I'm going to give it some edge colors of gray, and then those edge lines are going to be width of 2. I'm going to give a title. I'm going to give the y label a value as well, which is cases, and then I'm going to show my plot. So again, this is just an example of one plot. Please include at least another one in your submission. Okay, so this is basically the entire code of our assignment. Again, we import all the libraries, we fetch the data, we organize the data in a dictionary, we modify the data frame slightly to just capture, for in my case, just the first 5. You don't have to do the this part. You need to get all of them, and you don't have to index the names as I did, but again, it's up to you. Then dump the data to a CSV file. This is the original data, not updated, not manipulated at all. And then I want you to remove the world row. I want you to replace the blanks with zeros, and then dump the data again to a CSV file, and then dump the data to a table, which first you have to create a database, and then you have to plot that at least 1 or more graphs. Okay, so if I run this code, and the only visible outcome we see here is this plot. Again, it's a bar chart of the first 5 rows, and you can see here the different country values. The Y column has let's expand that. The Y column has the number of cases, and then down here we have the names of the different countries, and up here we have the title as well. So that's the only visible one. But if we also move to my Finder window, you can see that I created the CSV. Well, this is the cleanup CSV. The original CSV file got dumped here, and then the cleaned up version got dumped here, and also our database got created here. So let's look at them one by one. Here's my CSV data file. you can see here that I have a country index column instead of the blank index column. Now I call it country, and I still have my country, total cases, new cases, total deaths, and new deaths columns that I just created. And let's expand that. There we go. Okay, I still have the world row. Again, this is the original data frame. I did not modify it yet. So I still have my world row, and I still have my empty cells all over the place. Okay, so now let's look at the modified file after I cleaned it up. Let's expand this a bit. And there we go. I don't have, well, actually, let me make it like this. So my original data had the world column. I don't have a world column anymore. And then all my empty data cells that used to be here are now been replaced with zeros. Okay, let's take a look at our database. All right, I have one table in my database. It's called COVID table, and if I expand it, I have my 5 columns exactly the way I described them, text, integers. And then if I do the browse data, I see all my data with the zeros and no world row. Okay, so that's the assignment for the final project. Again, this is the code part, and then the second part of the project is going to be for a PowerPoint presentation where you explain all your code and all your effort on this project. So I hope this was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys in class. Take care, and bye for now.